Hello, this is your nerdy criminal justice professor, Dr. B, and I hope you're having a good day. In this video, I'm going to give you my twist to the history of punishment and corrections. Now, this is focused on ancient times through the Western world. Punishment and corrections was different more in the Eastern hemisphere, especially the Far East and what we now call the Middle East, although we're beginning really in the Middle East. Um, the um, Mesopotamian area is where um, humanity is supposed to have had its cradle. So we're going to start back that far. Now, this is a supplement to your textbook, so make sure you read the textbook. But in this video, you're going to have my little twist to it. So I hope you understand that. All right. It's important that we go back to the Code of Hammurabi. My hunch is by this point, you've already heard about the Code of Hammurabi. Um, it was written sometime between 1792, 1750 BC, thereabouts. It has 282 laws with specific crimes and punishments. It created lex talionis that we call eye for eye and tooth for tooth, only the Code of Hammurabi only has eye for eye, if memory serves. Um, and the purpose of it, according to the stela itself, and a stela or stela, spelled Stele, is this big obelisk, this big rock that has been carved into. So Hammurabi, the king, in Mesopotamia said that he was creating this code to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak. Very important for us to keep that in mind. So we move from there to ancient Israel. And if we look at the Pentateuch or the Torah, the first five books of what Christians call the Old Testament, um, what Jews call Tanakh, which stands for Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, um, we'll find lex talionis repeated. Now, the Torah is younger than Hammurabi. So it's important that we understand that eye for eye and tooth for tooth was not a new concept. We will talk about lex talionis, the eye for eye and tooth for tooth, when we talk about the philosophies of correction, which will be coming up pretty soon in the course. But the focus was on the community. So, and stoning was the primary punishment, that is, stoning to death. And the idea of stoning someone to death in especially the book of Exodus, where the actual legal codes are handed down, was that we are ridding the community of the poison within it. The person that is going to lead the community astray. So next we can come to ancient Rome and ancient Rome and Greece before Rome actually, but we're very similar. All sorts of different kinds of punishments. So crucifixion, and so you can see a photograph of crucifixion nails that have been dug out of archaeological sites. There's also a flogging whip there. Imprisonment um, did happen in ancient Rome, but the incarcerated had to support themselves. So people could starve to death in prison. Now, there were all sorts of other various tortures. There was banishment, all sorts of different punishments, but imprisonment was not very common. It did happen, but it wasn't all that common. Now, work camps, yes. Okay, so different types of punishment in early correctional history, and this is when we're getting more into actually the Enlightenment um, um, and the Renaissance before that. So there was the trial by ordeal, the gag, the constrained persons who were known to constantly scold others. I love that. There was the ducking stool, um, stocks, the pillory. Most of these were used as humiliation. So branding was humiliation and to warn the public, which is general deterrence. So whipping and all of these other punishments on this table. By the way, I'm going to also attach a PDF of the PowerPoint deck so that you can have it as well. So you'll have the PowerPoint deck yourself. So as we come more towards humane punishment and reform, very important for us to understand this, that late Enlightenment, um, for which the United States is a product, or from which the United States is a product, uh, the ideal of the Enlightenment thinkers. So there were Enlightenment thinkers that influenced many of the founding fathers of the United States. But William Penn, for whom Pennsylvania is named, who was a Quaker, and the idea of the great law, they believed that loss of liberty and hard labor were more effective than the death penalty. So Charles Montesquieu, by the way, Montesquieu and Cesare Beccaria, who is mentioned at the bottom of this slide, they were on the same page when it came um, to capital punishment. Francois Voltaire and Cesare Beccaria, so they're both mentioned at the bottom again, but the focus was more on human rights and the idea of punishment being proportional. Now, today we put down the idea of proportional punishment in criminal justice circles, those of us who are academics. But when Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Beccaria were saying it needs to be proportional, this was a leap forward in human rights, not a leap backwards. So that's something that we need to understand as we go through this history. So John Howard um, um, looked at the making of the penitentiary and he wanted to improve conditions in state prisons. Jeremy Bentham and his idea of the hedonistic calculus, which fed Cesare Beccaria's uh, deterrence theory. Um, these were all leaps forward in corrections and in our understanding of corrections and what would work. So let's talk about the prison. Now, this photograph, I did not take this photograph, a friend of mine did, but this photograph is of the inside of the old West Virginia State Penitentiary in Moundsville. A lot of movies have been filmed in this uh, penitentiary after it closed in the mid 90s. Charles Manson was in this prison for a brief period of time. Um, but let's kind of look at how we got the prison. So first, we can go back to ancient Egypt as far as 2000 BC, and there is some archaeological evidence that there were prisons that far back. In the 7th and 8th centuries BC in the Assyrian Empire, um, more evidence of prisons existing. So we in the Middle East, we know that far back. And then as far back as 451 BC, when Rome established the 12 tables, imprisonment was a punishment, but it was only for debt. Nothing else could there be imprisonment for. It was just for debt. When we fast forward into the Christian era, especially okay, when we talk about the first and second centuries, so the from 1 to 100 BC, and then from 101 to 200 BC, when we talk about those 2 centuries, Christianity was in its infancy. So the Catholic Church had not developed into what it would be. But once we get to 500 AD and going into um, the early Renaissance, especially, um, we see religious prisons. So people could be incarcerated for a lot of different things. Um, Anything that would get the label sacrilegious today was an incarcerationable offense. Now, back in those days, incarceration was generally a place of holding until punishment was administered, and it wasn't a punishment in and of itself. So keep that in mind when we talk about jails later on and pretrial felons. We talk about jails. So England, starting around 1500, started to develop workhouses. Um, Anyone who has seen any version of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens will note that Scrooge says, "Are there no workhouses?" Okay, so this is what Scrooge is referring to. So Bridewell was the first really well known, and so subsequent ones were simply called Bridewells. So Bridewells became a term for all workhouses, even though there was actually one called Bridewell at the very beginning. And this is it. This is a rendering of it. It is no longer standing, but this is a rendering of it, approximately at the time that it was up and running. So this was the Bridewell Workhouse. So the focus of punishment, as we move on, we need to kind of review this a little bit. So for the Code of Hammurabi, the Ten Commandments, and the 12 Tables, the goal was general protection of the weak and maintenance of the community. So even if we go back to the Ten Commandments and the full law as established in Exodus, Ten Commandments wasn't everything there. So much else in addition to the Ten Commandments. But when we look at that, all sorts of things to protect the weak, all sorts of civil type laws were established in the Old Testament in Exodus. For example, the idea that if you are wealthy and you own a field, when you're harvesting your field and stalks of grain fall on the ground, the law says you can't pick those up because the poor need to come and glean those from the field. So there was a lot of protection of the poor, protection of the weak in those older laws. So in ancient times and into the medieval period, punishment tended to be in response to an affront to the monarch. This is where Cesare Beccaria comes into play. Beccaria says we're never going to deter people from crime if they don't know from one day to the next what is a crime, because the monarch changes it from one day to the next depending on whether they are offended. In general terms, I'm putting that in my own words, but that's basically what Beccaria was trying to say. And Beccaria didn't like the belief in the divine right of kings. Most people during the Enlightenment didn't like the idea of the divine right of kings. The U.S. wouldn't be here if the founders of the U.S. believed in the divine right of kings. Now, the founders were a little hypocritical because they believed in the divine right of a particular race, it seems like, at that time. Um, um, some of the laws that were written immediately after the U.S. Constitution was ratified, allowing that black slaves were not a full human. Okay, that is an affront. That belief is an affront to the idea that there is no such thing as divine right of kings. Divine. So just transferring it to a larger group, the idea of divine right is kind of hypocritical in my mind. You got to make your own conclusions on that. Okay, but I'm just throwing that out. So after the conversion of Constantine, punishment became about maintaining orthodoxy. This is something that's very important to understand. It became more about maintaining orthodoxy with a view of cohesion among the population. Okay, I grew up in a Christian church being taught how wonderful Constantine was, that he legalized Christianity. As I began to study the history more myself, it appeared to me that Constantine picked Christianity because he felt that it would help garner cohesion within his population and help strengthen his position as the emperor. Just something to keep in mind. And then there's Cesare Beccaria. He advocated for a reform system. Punishment should be for an affront to the community, not the monarch, via harm to an individual in the community, not a sovereign or a monarch. So this is what Beccaria advocated. Now, there are two main elements that need to be considered in the emergence of the prison. One, we took a shift from punishing the body to punishing the soul. That is, we went from torture and corporal punishment to the deprivation of rights, such as incarceration and forced labor. Okay? And then we switched to where incarceration was for criminals, not non-criminals, such as those who are in debt. No more debtor's prison. So punishment in early America, okay, again, you're going to get the PDF of the PowerPoint. So this is just kind of the early prisons. So we're going to look at Eastern State Penitentiary here in a minute. But the old Newgate Prison, established in 1773, and then it closed in 1827. So then we had the Walnut Street Jail, the Auburn Prison, Western State Penitentiary, and Eastern State Penitentiary. Now we're going to talk about Auburn and Eastern here in just a minute. By the way, the inmates at Auburn, which is still in existence and still being used, built Sing Sing Prison. All right, so 1773 to 1784, the Walnut Street Prison opens. So there were different iterations of it. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner an artist rendering from 1774. So it was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. By the way, it was torn down in order to build Eastern State Penitentiary. Now, above the old Walnut Street Prison, you will see Auburn Correctional Facility. Right there it is. And then in the bottom left-hand corner, you see Eastern State Penitentiary and the city of Philadelphia in the background because it is still there. Now, all of those buildings around Eastern State were not there when it was built. Okay. It's important to understand that in 1787, when the Quakers founded the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating Miseries of Public Prisons, okay, the goal was to renovate existing facilities and establish the prison as the basic form of punishment. But they wanted to do that. This is very important to remember. They wanted to do that in order to make punishment more humane. Okay? That was their goal, to make punishment more humane. So that organization was founded in 1787. Well, the Constitution had already been sent to the states for ratification, but it wasn't finally ratified until 1788. Now, it was that Society for Alleviating Miseries of Public Prisons that led to the establishment of Western and Eastern State Penitentiaries. So we have the two systems, the Pennsylvania system, which was the Eastern State Penitentiary. Western State was there as well, but it was not as prominent as Eastern State. So there was Eastern State Penitentiary, and it had a solitary system. completely solitary. So inmates um, were in single cells. They were basically in solitary confinement the entire time of their incarceration, regardless of what their crime was, regardless of their danger to anyone else in the prison, regardless of any rules they might have violated. They were in solitary confinement the entire time. They had to work, and all the materials they needed to work were brought to their cell. They ate their meals in their cell. They were not permitted to speak unless they were told to speak. Now, the idea of the penitentiary that the Quakers had, the Quakers thought we are very outstanding citizens, and we got that way by hard work and Bible study. So the idea of the penitentiary is we're going to force them to do hard work and Bible study. Unfortunately, the Bible study actually went by the wayside pretty quickly. I mean, they did have some services, but if the warden was a Catholic, it was everything as far as the religion goes in that prison was going to be Catholicism. If the warden was a Protestant, then it was going to be Protestant, and it was going to be the brand of Protestantism of that warden. So there was very little religious freedom. But when they were forced to fund themselves because the states didn't give them much funding, so they had to fund themselves. Well, how do you do that? By making the inmates make products and selling those products. So that was both with the Pennsylvania and the New York system. So the New York system, as exemplified with the Auburn prison, was a congregate work system, not an assembly line the way Henry Ford made, but it was kind of an assembly line. So one person would do one part, and then they would pass it on to another person to do another part. But it wasn't a conveyor belt where this was happening really, really quickly. But it was kind of an assembly line work. Henry Ford created the conveyor belt type assembly line. He didn't invent the assembly line itself, just so everyone knows. So neither system was able to live up to their ideals. So there were a lot of outside pressures. Okay, the public has their ideas about what should happen in a prison, and that's a big pressure. Politicians have their ideas about what should happen inside these prisons, and even though the politicians weren't really funding them, um, they got to choose who ran them. So a lot of outside pressures, and then the fiduciary concerns, or the fiduciary consequences. Um, Now, it's important to understand this about Eastern State Penitentiary. Charles Dickens visited it when he toured the U.S. When he came here and he toured, and then he published a book called American Notes. So he was here in 1842. I believe well, you should have already read the chapter called Philadelphia and its solitary prison. But I'm going to read this because it's so important for you to keep this particular text within that chapter in mind. So these are the words of Dickens himself. I believe that very few men are capable of estimating the immense amount of torture and agony which this dreadful punishment, prolonged for years, inflicts upon the sufferers. And in guessing at it myself, and in reasoning from what I have seen written upon their faces, and what to my certain knowledge they feel within, I am only the more convinced that there is a depth of terrible endurance in which none but the sufferers themselves can fathom, and which no man has a right to inflict upon his fellow creature. I hold this slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain to be immeasurably worse than any torture of the body. And because its ghastly signs and tokens are not so palpable to the eye and sense of touch as scars upon the flesh, because its wounds are not upon the surface, and it extorts few cries that human ears can hear, therefore the more I denounce it, as a secret punishment which slumbering humanity is not roused up to stay. Now, that's an interesting concept when we realize that just not quite 20 years earlier, that Eastern State Penitentiary was founded as a way of trying to be more humane in punishment. Just keep that in mind. All right, so Jeremy Bentham was very important in developing correctional philosophy, and he fancied himself an architect as well, and he designed a type of prison that he called the Panopticon. To my knowledge, this is the only one ever built, and this is a photograph of it. You can tell that it is not in use. The Panopticon was a round building with a tower in the middle, and the correctional officer in the tower in the middle could walk around the tower and look into every cell and see what was going on. We'll talk about prison architecture a little bit later in the semester, but I bring this up now because even as far back as the 1700s and 1800s, folks like Jeremy Bentham were thinking about optimizing supervision within institutions. All right, so early history of jails and prisons in the U.S. I just thought I would throw this in here for you all. It goes all the way back to 1683 and up to 1900, so that you can kind of see just a little bit of the history. So the reformatory in America, very important for us to start to understand more about the reformatories. Now, these were developed earlier than 1870, but an organization called the National Prison Association in 1870 drafted its Declaration of Principles. Now, the National Prison Association still exists, but its name is different. It is now the American Correctional Association, or the ACA, and they actually accredit prisons, much like different accrediting agencies for education will accredit schools like Appalachian State. So in their principles, reformation over punishment was very important. They advocated for classification of inmates, meaning that we don't just throw all inmates together as though they're all the same. We're going to look at them, and some inmates need more supervision than others. They advocated for indeterminate sentences, which we will talk about a little later. Indeterminate sentences mean that basically, from their standpoint, if an inmate is showing that they are reforming, then they can reduce their sentence. And the idea of self-efficacy, meaning that we need to teach inmates to have self-efficacy, be able to control themselves so that others don't have to control them. So this is the Elmira Reformatory, which was built in 1876. Now, they developed individualized plans for reform. So we still have those. Now, there is some evidence that there's limited success in rehabilitation, not strong success. Professor colleague friend of mine at another school and he is on several dissertation committees, and he's the chair of several as well right now. And a lot of the dissertations he's reading, he said, are showing that rehabilitation just doesn't work. We just need to punish them. Well, I don't know that rehabilitation doesn't work. Unfortunately, having worked in a prison full time for 10 years and trying to do rehabilitation in its pure form, there are things that get in the way of doing it right. So perhaps it's not rehabilitation that doesn't work so much as it is that there are other policies and procedures that prevent rehabilitation from being done in a successful way. Okay. So 1900s to the end of World War II. So basically around a 50 to 60-year prison or time frame. We had the prison farming systems. Post-Civil War. Um, because, by the way, the 13th Amendment did not end slavery in the U.S. It ended slavery in most instances, except when someone had been convicted by due process of law. So once Reconstruction ended, so when we had the Electoral College crisis, um, and the Democrats bowed to the Republicans um, with the promise that the federal troops would pull out of the South, and they did. Reconstruction ended, and Jim Crow South began to blossom. So many laws were passed specifically to be able to incarcerate what people who would have been called freedmen or freed slaves at the time. So once they were incarcerated, then they could be loaned out in for a fee called convict leasing, and that's where the prison farming systems came into play. So the progressive era said, we need to have more humane treatment of inmates, and this is when we started to see deviance as a social and psychological issue. So during the progressive era, we begin to have fields like sociology and social work and psychology. It's important to understand that Freud and Durkheim did most of their work during the progressive era. But this also gave us the era of the big house. Okay? We don't really use that term for prisons anymore, but that's what we used to call it, the big house. But we also got the medical model. So a stronger mental health approach started to come into play. Criminality was the result of internal deficiencies. The person wasn't bad, they were sick. But we also got the crime control models. Okay, so the modern correctional system, we've got the Federal Bureau of Prisons that was established in 1930. There are more than 100 facilities. 12% are citizens of other countries. Now, that was the figure during Biden's presidency, and it might have gone up now, but 12% of the population of the Federal Bureau of Prisons were citizens of another country. So when we talk about state corrections, greater than 50% of them are violent offenders. So more than half of them are violent offenders. Ideally, that's who we want incarcerated, right? People who do violence against other people. It is the most common form of correction. So is state corrections. And then the state budgets are smaller than the Bureau of Prisons. All right, so the four largest state correctional systems, and I haven't looked to see if these numbers have changed, but the four largest are Texas, California, Florida, and New York. Now, I want to say this begs the issue about California and New York, thinking that they are so progressive. Believe it or not, California, their population has grown. California is not that great with its prison population. Folks don't like to hear that, but it's not. So that's something that it's very important to keep in mind about modern corrections. As far as the history, we've got state corrections, we've got the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Now, this is a little bit of a longer video, so I apologize for it being so long. We will see you next time.